Good evening, everyone. We finally have solved our various mechanical issues here. We finally have gotten our mechanical issues solved, which might seem to be a simple thing, but at least we're off that now. I want to welcome you to Center Congregational Church. We're very happy to have all of you here and to have the Windham World Affairs Council with their program here. I just want to mention one little practical matter, and that is that the bathrooms are out this door and down the hall, in case anybody needs to use them. I wanted to just mention to you that there are some things going on here at the church that you might be interested in. We have our Christmas Bazaar and Luncheon tomorrow morning, and tomorrow afternoon there is the annual Messiah Sing, which has been a very popular event, and it's been sponsored by the Guilford Friends of Music at Guilford. People who come to that should bring not money to get in, but a can of something or some food that they can give away to people who need it. So finally, of course, our Advent services will be on Sunday, as usual. And now I'd like to turn the mic over to Esau, who will introduce our speaker.
I think I am okay. Am I correct? I have to speak? Okay. They gave me all this equipment here that I don't need, but greetings to you, ladies and gentlemen. Again, welcome. I am grateful that you're all here regarding of the weather and snow and rain and everything else that goes on there. Before introducing our very distinguished speaker, Ambassador Galbraith, let me make one impolite request. Those of you who have not yet become a member and participate, it would be nice to register and become a member. And the fee is price of few hamburgers, $35 per year for one person and $50 for the family. This will help us pay for the fees for the church and other places that we hold the meetings and coffee and cake and other things that we offer. So that was my impolite request. The second issue before introducing Professor Dr. Galbraith is what is happening next Sunday. We have a gathering, a kind of fundraising for children in Chile.
No, Haiti.
Haiti, thank you. It is a program. It is a program which is on December 9th at 5 p.m. at 118 Elliott in Brattleboro. It is organized by HOST, which is for Haiti Orphanage Sponsorship Trust. So there is again a great film to show about the country, the culture, the people. There is a soup, food for those who are on a special diet. There is going to be things that you will like. So hope you can also make that. With this remark, which I hope you got, let me now introduce Ambassador Galbraith. Ambassador Galbraith has spoken to us annually. This is the 5th consecutive year that he has shared his knowledge and insider's experience on the Near East with our community. He was the first U.S. ambassador to Croatia from 1993 to 1998 and was the negotiator of the 1995 Erdut agreement that ended the Croatian War. In 2015, He led the first Harvard University trip to Iran since the 1979 revolution and learned a great deal about the country, which he will share with us tonight and later. He is currently working on a meditation project related to Syria and has made 12 trips into the country in the past 3 years. Ambassador Galbraith is also our neighbor in Windham County, a long-time resident of Townsend. He began his career teaching at Windham College, the School of International Training and Keene State College. From 2011 to 2015, he represented Windham County in the Vermont Senate. Tonight, Ambassador Galbraith's topic couldn't be more timely. The Trump administration has cited Iran's proxy war in the region as one reason for withdrawing from the Iran nuclear agreement. At the same time, President Trump has put the U.S. firmly on the side of Saudi Arabia. Is there a risk of war with Iran, either because someone in the Trump administration wants war, or is there a risk of war with Iran as unintended consequences of muddled policy, broken agreement, or harsh rhetoric? Ambassador Galbraith will address these questions tonight. May I present our great neighbor from Townsend for his talk on the U.S. versus Iran. Will a proxy fight in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen lead to a war? Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ambassador.
Isa, thank you for that introduction. I always hate to make a correction or an addition to what the introducer has said, but yes, I've done it for the last 5 consecutive years, but actually I think it's getting on to 18. And it's only a continuation of lectures by Ambassador Galbraith, because my father gave a lecture every year to the Windham World Affairs Council. So I'm thinking, I don't know how long the World Affairs Council has been around.
54 years. 54 years.
Yeah, I think we're getting to, I'm not sure every year was covered, but we're getting, I think we're probably about 50 years. And you know, the wonderful thing about this audience here is of course, there are a fair number of people who have been to a large part of them. and that's a wonderful thing. You know, one of the things I always hear from World Affairs Councils is, you know, why can't we get more young people involved? And when I was younger and speaking, I'd always do little explanations. And then I began to think about it. I said, don't worry about it. They're going to be future old people. But, you know, I want to also come to Isa's point about joining and participating. And, you know, Isa's background is from Iran, and I'm going to talk about Iran. So I thought it would be appropriate to share with you one of my favorite bits of Iranian verse from Omar Khayyam. And there's some you're more familiar with, but my favorite one is this. And it's really in connection with getting people to join and come up with that money.
Great.
Some sigh for glories past, while the prophet dreams of the world to come. But as for me, I'll take the cash and let the credit run. So, let me turn now to the topic at hand. This is really the question, is whether we're going to end up in a war with Iran. I don't need to say to this audience that war is generally not a very good idea, and that war can have unintended consequences. I think we've certainly learned that from our experience in Iraq, and before that in Vietnam, where I was just a few weeks ago. But even in comparison with those two, a war with Iran, a country of 80 million, whose population is going to be quite united, perhaps with the exception of the Kurdish component, would be something that would be a major undertaking. I dare say, with catastrophic for Iran, the Iranian people, for the region, and possibly for the United States. So I want to lead into that and then see whether this might happen as a result of policies that are underway. So the beginning point, of course, is the nuclear deal. And with the decision by Trump to not to continue, well, to break the deal, to terminate a deal that the United States had entered. But I think first it would be important to review what it was that the nuclear deal accomplished. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action involved the United States, Russia, China, France, Britain, Germany, and there were, it's 579 pages? 59 pages. But the most important points are these. It shut down both of Iran's routes to nuclear weapons, either from enriched uranium or plutonium. It included intrusive inspections, which stretched the breakout time. What this means is the amount of time it would be between an Iranian decision to make nuclear weapons. Obviously, they've mastered a great deal of the technology, and this is, if you think about it, it's 73-year-old technology going back to Hiroshima. They've mastered that, but the question is, how much time would the world have between their decision to go for nuclear weapons and actually having them? And one of the points of the purposes of the JCPOA was to stretch that out. And then in terms of plutonium, their main heavy water reactor at Arak had the core removed and concrete placed in it so it wouldn't be usable. They agreed that they would have no new heavy water reactors for 15 years. And with regard to uranium, they agreed to eliminate the medium enriched uranium that they held. Now, uranium to low enriched is 3%. That's what tends to be used for power plants. High enriched, 93% is what you can use for bombs. The point is that when you've got it to medium enriched, it's a big step from 3.7% to 20%, a much smaller step from 20% to 93%. And so there was great concern to get rid of the 20%. They agreed to eliminate all of that. They agreed to eliminate 98% of their low-enriched uranium. They agreed to limit future uranium enrichment to 3.6% for 15 years, and to reduce their 19,000 centrifuges, which are how you produce the enriched uranium, to some 6,000. Now, obviously, and in exchange for this, they got basically complete sanctions relief from the Europeans and relief of the American sanctions that were related to the nuclear program, but not American sanctions that were related to their other activities. So that was the deal. Was it ideal? No, but it had a lot of merits. Now, there were, when the administration decided, and the very important point is that Iran was following the deal. In fact, it eliminated its uranium much more quickly than than was required by the agreement, or than many of than most observers expected. So and nobody has quarreled, but that they are in full compliance with the agreement. The Trump administration agrees with that as well. But the stated objections, and there are many people who think that the real agenda is not just the stated objections, but we'll stay with the stated objections for the moment. The stated objections were, the stated reasons for abrogating the agreement were in three categories. First, that the sunset provisions, in other words, the 15 years, was wrong, that these restrictions on enrichment and on heavy water reactors should be permanent. I might add that Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it was abiding by its obligations under the treaty. So these are steps that were in addition to what it was required under the treaty. And you certainly would make an argument that the treaty, which was done in the 1960s, its provisions 50 years later, are probably not sufficient, but they are important, and Iran was in compliance. And so even at the end of the sunset period, Iran will still be a party to the nuclear non-proliferation. It still will be prohibited from getting nuclear weapons. But in any event, the Trump administration said the agreement was a terrible agreement, worst ever agreement negotiated by the United States. And one of the reasons was that, that some of these restrictions, not all of them, but some of them expired after 15 years. The second objection was that that the agreement didn't cover Iran's ballistic missile program. And the concern was that you could, of course, Iran might continue to develop ballistic missiles, then it would have the capability of delivering nuclear weapons. Now, of course, the agreement wasn't about ballistic missiles. It was about the nuclear program. But, okay, the objection was that it didn't cover everything. And the third issue is that Iran's malign activities in the region, specifically its involvement in support of the Houthis in Yemen, and I'll talk about this, in support of the Assad regime in Syria, and its activities in Iraq. And we'll discuss a little bit why that was a very peculiar kind of objection, given what the Trump administration itself has been doing on Iran's behalf in Iraq. Now, these are the objections. The logic behind the agreement and the sunset from the people who negotiated it is that 15 years is a bit of time, and the world tends to change in 15 years. Imagine, if in 1987 we were talking about, how to stand up to the Soviet Union. In fact, you could say in the 1980s we spent an unnecessary additional $1 trillion on defense. As Senator Moynihan used to say, the CIA told us everything about the Soviet Union except that it wasn't going to be there. But clearly that was wasted expenditure. And so could Iran be very different in 15 years? Well, I tell you, from visiting it, I feel very strongly that it's likely to be different. And this goes back to one of my formative experiences. In 1968 and 1971, I spoke Russian. I mostly don't now. I visited the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and I was struck by one thing in those countries, which was basically nobody believed in communism. In fact, it really seemed to me that the only people who believed in communism were right-wing conservatives in the United States. They thought that communism was a powerful system, so powerful that once, and this is Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was Reagan's ambassador to the UN, so powerful that once it swallowed up a country, it could never be released, and that's why we should support Pinochet in Chile, the South African apartheid regime, and so on. But, if you enter a country where people, by and large, don't believe, sooner or later, I think the system's going to collapse. It took a long time, from 68 to 89, 21 years. Well, 15 years is a good chunk of 89. And in Iran, one of the things that's so striking is is how openly people talk against the regime. I mean, there's very little sense of fear. In fact, when I gave a lecture about the nuclear agreement there, the guide provided by the Iranian government said, I don't agree with Ambassador Galbraith at all. You can't trust these mullahs. They won't keep their word. They're terrible people. After explaining that he was a descendant of the prophet, he then basically went on about how there was nothing good to come out of Arabia, including Islam, and it really destroyed the fine Zoroastrian traditions. In mosques, and these are the great sites of Iran, and these terrific mosques, people would come up to our group from Harvard, and they would say, where are you from? And there was a Swedish guy on the trip, and so he thought he'd be neutral. He worked in New York. He said, Sweden. No interest. Next person, where are you from? America. Oh, America. Swedish guy began to say New York. One point I was accosted by the guardian of one of the holiest Shiite shrines. Very, very devout place. Where are you from? America. Oh, America. America, very good. Obama, very good. I began to smile. Bush, very good. Well, okay. I was diplomatic. So anyhow, so my point is that, and incidentally, Iran has some of the freer elections in the entire Middle East, and people have voted overwhelmingly against the hardliners. Now, it's not totally free in the sense that they restrict the candidates, but where they get a choice, they express it. And there is also huge use of social media in Iran, and ongoing protests against the regime. In fact, people are often saying on social media and in protests, why are you spending the money in Syria? Spend it at home. Actually, Trump has some support in Iran that people express on social media for overthrowing the regime. I say all this by making the point that I think it's a little, there's a pretty good reason to think that the sunset provisions, that we're going to face a different situation. And I have to say, in international relations, time is an enormous factor. The world as it is today is not necessarily what the world is going to be in the future. And I think all of us who've lived through the Cold War would know that. Let me turn now to of course, the agreement wasn't about missiles, and it wasn't about Iran's malign activities in the region. But I want to talk about the Iranian response to the unilateral decision of the United States to break a treaty, a treaty incidentally endorsed by the UN Security Council. The core of the bargain in the treaty was Iran did all these things and sanctions were lifted. The Trump administration has not only reimposed the sanctions, but they've imposed secondary sanctions aimed at destroying the Iranian economy. What are the primary sanctions? You can't buy stuff or deal with the US. Well, the Iranians haven't been, that's not so painful. But the secondary sanctions say if any company is doing business in Iran, it can't do business in the United States. And if you're Total, the French oil company, which is listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and you have a project in Iran, which they did, who are you going to choose between being listed in the New York Stock Exchange or your project in Iran? And the other thing that the United States banks are the clearinghouse for transactions. So basically, if you can't use US banks, you can't have a payment system. So imposing these secondary sanctions, which went beyond the sanctions that that brought Iran to this agreement, is very, very strong activity against Iran. So the question is, how have the Iranians responded? It's very interesting. They haven't pulled out of the agreement, which of course they'd be perfectly entitled to do. One party doesn't keep its part of the agreement, the other party's not obligated to do it. Nope, they've continued to honor it, and they are working with the Europeans who totally disagree with the United States and are now moving to create their own payment system that bypasses the dollar. So this move is something that is going to cost the United States one of its biggest tools in diplomacy. So the Iranians are working with the Europeans. They have continued to abide by the agreement. Secondly, in terms of missiles, they have done nothing provocative. Think of the North Koreans shooting off one missile larger than the other in 2017. The Iranians could do that. They haven't done it. And with regard to their malign activities, well, they aren't doing anything different from what they had been doing. And as I will try to discuss, a great deal of this is, I'll just, without making judgment, we'll try to explain what it is that they are doing. But okay, that's the, so in many cases, the Iranians have not risen. If you think that there are people in the administration who would like a war in Iran, and frankly, I think there are, and one of them is a fellow that I know, so I think there are people who would love to have a war with Iran. The Iranians are basically, not being provocative, and so all of this comes down to their malign activities in the region. Incidentally, it's worth a point on why are they not being provocative. Well, think of what Iran's national security goal is. It's to diminish U.S. influence in the world and in the region. And from their point of view, Donald Trump is doing a great job of just that. You know, if your adversary is about to jump off a very high building, it's not necessary to push. Trump's action on Iran has split the European allies from the United States. Merkel, Macron, who really tried to make it nice with Trump, May, Tusk, the European Union, Trudeau, they're all against him. And there's an article in Foreign Policy today about how they're chortling behind the back as in the G20 summit because of this latest Cohen Russian revelation that when he claimed he wasn't doing business in Moscow, he was still doing it in 2016. And they're coming to the conclusion that he may not finish his term. I'm not sure I share that, but that's what the reporting is. But the point is, if you're from the Iranian point of view, what has this issue done? And what is your policy of still working with the Europeans? It's split the Europeans from Trump. And probably this is the number one issue, this and the Paris Climate Accord, as well as matters of style. But on substance, this is it. So, this is not a totally unwise strategy on their part. But let me now turn to the places where war and where hawks who may want to have a war are focused. And number one is Yemen. Now, the war in Yemen is a conflict between the Houthis and the government in exile of Hadi, the previous president who was driven out of Sana'a by the Houthis. But basically, it's a war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Now, and it's in a country where Al-Qaeda is present. And if you look at the map, the darker color along the coast of Aden is the area where Al-Qaeda is present. There's in pretty sparsely areas to the east is where the Hadi government is, and also on the Red Sea. And then the main parts of the country, including the capital Sana'a, are controlled by the Houthis. Now, who are the Houthis? The Houthis are Zaydis. So they're not the Shia. The Shia traditional Shias are 12ers. the descendants of those, the split in Islam between Sunnis and Shia basically goes between the Sunnis, who said that the leader of the Islamic community should be the companions of the Prophet, and then continuing down, basically the most learned or the most powerful, and the Shia have basically taken the position that the leaders of the Islamic community, of the Ummah, should be the descendants of the Prophet through his daughter, because he didn't have any surviving sons. The course of the Shia grievance is that the Sunnis have basically massacred the 12 descendants of the Prophet, and that's the main branch of Shia Islam. But there is another branch that goes to another male descendant of the Prophet, grandson, Zaid, and in this tradition, the leader of the community, the imam, has to be a descendant of the Prophet, but not the eldest son, so not through primogeniture, and it usually didn't go father to son. And those people ruled Yemen from 600 whatever until 1962, when a coup organized by Nasser in Egypt ousted them, and then came a series of Arab nationalist governments that had brought us up to recent days, recent years, until basically the Houthis struck back. Now, if the Houthis are Shia, who is their great adversary ideologically? It's Al-Qaeda. What is the group that's linked to who's fighting the Houthis? It's the guys that the Saudis are supporting and that the United States is supporting. Now, part of the complaint that the Trump administration makes about Yemen is that the Houthis are using Iranian missiles to hit targets in Saudi Arabia, like airfields, including the airport in Riyadh. But the Saudis are bombing using cluster bombs and extensive bombing of Yemen. And I think almost anybody would say that hitting an airfield from which military aircraft fly, also civilian, is in fact a legitimate target. But this is the complaint of the administration, that Iran is aiding the Houthis, even though in the war against Sunni extremism, the Houthis, you would think, would be a kind of natural ally of the United States. And this war, the death toll of this war is actually, in the fighting, is not that great, about 10,000. But the United Nations now says, as a result of the blockade of Yemen's ports, and particularly Hudaydah up there, that 13 million Yemenis are in danger of starvation, and there have been significant deaths of children through starvation.
85,000.
Yeah, 85,000, okay. So far. And incidentally, one of the things about starvation and malnutrition, and I began my career seeing the famine in Cambodia and trying to deal with it in 1980 after as a result of the Pol Pot rule there, is children who are affected by famine don't fully recover. So, these are lifelong consequences for the survivors. That's Yemen, and we have put ourselves on the side of Saudi Arabia against the Houthis, and therefore a battleground against Iran with very tough rhetoric. Now we come to Syria. And this is the map of Syria as it is now. The red is the Assad regime. The green up at Idlib is jihadis, Sunni extremists, plus some Free Syrian Army. The groups that were initially backed by the United States, but we moved away long in the Obama administration from that. I mean, they backed him at a certain point in the Obama administration in a small way, and then I think wisely stopped backing him because they became extremists, or the extremists took over. But these are backed by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. And above that is Afrin, which was Kurdish, but then Turkey invaded earlier this year. And essentially, other than that, it's the government or the regime, and yellow is the Kurdish area. And just to show, and so what I've been doing has been going to the Kurdish area, initially in a mediation effort to try to get the Kurdish factions to have a united front. Secondly, to mediate with Bernard Kouchner, the former French minister who's been my companion on this and the guy who founded Doctors Without Borders, between the Syrian Kurds and the Kurdistan government in Iraqi Kurdistan. They're sort of like Democrats and Republicans in Washington at each other's throat. Now basically trying to help the Syrian Kurds think about negotiating strategies with Damascus, because it's pretty clear these are the two parts of the country, either they reach an agreement or the country remains divided, and it may well just remain divided. The Iranians have been big supporters of the Assad regime, along with the Russians. The United States is now backing the Syrian Kurds. We have 3,000, well, we have at least 3,000 troops on the ground, maybe more, because we're not being honest about the numbers there. The Syrian Kurds have been the most effective fighters against the Islamic State. And you can see just a little black area over here. The business about Palmyra isn't really important because it's desert, but right along the Euphrates River, there's a small section. That's where the Islamic State remains. Look at this map, and now look at this is what it was in 2014. All that is the Islamic State. So you see the extent of the defeat, and just that little dot at the top of the map in the center, that's Kobani, which is, now you see the expansion of the Kurdish territory. And what had been a multi-sided war is basically now a two-way war. Now here, in Yemen, you see the Trump administration aligned with Saudi Arabia. In Syria, it's a little unclear what the policy is. Trump tweeted, that our troops are going to be out of Syria very soon, by the end of the year. But the man he appointed as the Syria coordinator, Ambassador Jeffries, he said the administration's position is that we will remain in Syria until Iran and its proxies are gone. Who are Iran's proxies in Syria? Hezbollah, the Shia militia from Lebanon, the Iraqi Shia from the government that we've been supporting in Iraq, and Afghan Shia, who, as well as some other non-Shia Afghans, who basically have gone to Iran, and Iran has said, well, if you'd like to stay here, you have to go fight in Syria, as well as some Pakistanis. So basically, and not all that many Iranians, although they're in the command positions. So is the position of the United States that we're going to get out soon, as the president has said? Or is the position of the United States that we are going to remain until Iran is gone, in which case we'll be there forever, unless somehow we were to march on Damascus, which I think is not in the cards. But this presence is part of the anti-Iran strategy. Incidentally, it makes it a hell of a problem for the Syrian Kurds. If the Americans are going to be there forever, they have a pretty good hand negotiating with Damascus. If the Americans are leaving, they have a very weak hand because Turkey would love to come in and crush them. So, it's been a difficult situation for them. So we have a a bit of uncertainty in Syria, but this is one of the battlegrounds, and we're with the Kurds, and Iran is the main supporter of Assad, again, because he's an Alawite, which is another branch of Shia Islam, even though maybe 75% of Syria is Sunni. The other parts are Druze and Christian. I guess reduced that 65%. But the Alawites are only about 12%. The Yemen war, 10,000 combatants dead, starvation, and possibly something much worse than what's happened in Syria. But what's happened in Syria is unbelievably costly, with 360 to 400,000 killed. With half the population displaced and some 6 million people as refugees. Now, turning to Iraq. And this is really the bizarre part of the story. So remember, the reason we've terminated the Iran nuclear deal, the stated reason, is that we're concerned about the sunset. We want it extended. We're concerned about missiles. The Iranians have been totally unprovocative about that. They've basically, let Trump's action weaken the United States and divide us from our allies. And in Iraq, though, it's something very unusual. The consequence of the American invasion in 2003 of Iraq was to remove the Sunni who had run Iraq. Sunnis are 20% of the population of Iraq. From the founding of the country with the monarchy through Saddam Hussein, and to have democratic elections in 2005, completely democratic, which brought to power, with an absolute majority, Shiite religious parties, that one of which was one of the two major ones was founded in Tehran in 1982, and the other was supported by Iran. And I have to say, in foreign policy, it turns out when you make a mistake, how do you respond to it? Many people might say, okay, I made a mistake, I'm going to cut my losses. But here, the response has been to double down and pretend that this isn't what happened. And therefore, the Iranian-supported religious parties are the very same parties that the United States is supporting and arming. And this was most dramatic last October. You'll know that the Kurds are a subject near and dear to my heart for 35 years now, my first trip to Iraqi Kurdistan. And in September of 2017, they organized a referendum. One of the best elections ever, completely peaceful, without the slightest hint of coercion or fraud, in which huge turnout, and everybody came to the polls wearing their finest clothes, and women in very elegant, colorful Kurdish clothes, and bringing their children to do what? To vote in a referendum on whether Kurdistan should be an independent country. And the vote was 93% for independence. The United States had basically, of course, this is what the Kurds had wanted from the creation of Iraq until today. So it was certainly no surprise. But in 2014, the Kurds encountered this situation. ISIS had taken over all of the north of Iraq. As Masoud Barzani, then the president of the Kurdistan region, said to me, he said, we have a border of 1,060 kilometers with the Islamic State, and we have a border of 15 kilometers with Iraq. Iraq doesn't exist, so we're going to go for independence now. Then John Kerry, the American Secretary of State, showed up and said, got off the plane, he grabbed Barzani's chief of staff who was greeting him and said, "I know what you want, but don't do it now. We've got to fight the Islamic State." I was there, and I must say my advice was, do it now. But President Barzani thought of the Americans as allies and listened to the American Secretary of State. By 2017, the Islamic State had been defeated. The central government in Baghdad was looking stronger. The opportunity for independence. By who? By the people who are the most pro-American people in the Middle East, who have been America's ally. Remember how did the Islamic State take over northern Iraq? Because the Iraqi army, which we've spent billions building up, disappeared, ran away. This enormous investment. Why? Because the Shiite officers and soldiers didn't even think of Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, as their country. And because they were also corrupt. But maybe less than 1,000 ISIS fighters took over Mosul, but certainly not more than 2,000, with 30,000 Iraqi troops supposedly defending it. We had equipped and trained, and of course they captured all this American equipment. And they used the American equipment against the Kurds, who had been our allies, who we wouldn't arm. In fact, The Onion had a wonderful headline, "Pentagon to arm ISIS directly," to skip the Iraqi middleman, Iraqi army middleman. Okay, finally, at enormous sacrifice by the Kurds with American air support and with support of finally some new Iraqi counterterrorism units that were effective, the Islamic State is defeated in Iraq. Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, who is of the Dawa party, but whom we love, or at least the administration loves, I won't do every we, has decided that his path to election victory in the 2018 elections in Iraq is by the victory over ISIS, and now he's got to deal with the Kurds. Into Iraq comes Qasem Soleimani. He is the head of the Quds Force from Iran. He works with Abadi, and they draw up a plan to attack the Kurds in Kirkuk. So in a plan that's designed by the head of the Quds, talk about malign activities of Iran, in Iraq, to attack America's allies, what does the Trump administration do? Incidentally, 3 days, this is, on October 17th, on October 14th, the U.S. had announced it was going to withdraw from the JCPOA. So 3 days after withdrawing from the nuclear deal, what do? They give a green light to a Shia militia headed by a guy named Abu Mahdi Muhandis to use American Abrams tanks to attack the Kurds, who are America's allies, and to take the city of Kirkuk and to advance north, and finally the Kurds put up an effective resistance and stopped them, using German Milan anti-tank rockets to destroy American Abrams tanks that the Trump administration had allowed a Shia militia to use against the Kurds. Now, who is Abu Mahdi Muhandis? Well, actually, he was sentenced to death in Kuwait in the 1980s for blowing up the American embassy in December of 1983. So talk about confused. And then in the most recent elections, it turned, Abadi, supposedly our guy, now he had victory in Mosul, victory over the Kurds in Kirkuk. He ran for election. He rather failed in learning the lessons of Winston Churchill and George H.W. Bush, which is that military victory doesn't always translate into political success. In fact, quite often doesn't. And so in the elections, which the Trump administration expected him to win, his party finished third. Who finished first? Muqtada al-Sadr. Remember him? Actually attacking American troops in Iran in the first decade of this century. He then went off to Iran to study. Now he came back and he kind of took a anti-Iran stance, but also very anti-American. Number 2 was Hadi Amiri. Who's he? Well, he's the head of the Shia militias. He actually fought on Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq war. Abadi from Dawa, a party supported by Iran, came in 3rd, and Maliki, who was the previous prime minister, also from Dawa, a party supported by Iran, came in 4th. And yet these are the people that the Trump administration are supporting against our allies, and yet at the same time, we're saying we're opposed to Iran's activities, malign activities in Iraq. In any event, so you might detect that there's a certain incoherence. Now, are we going to go to war with Iran? I don't know. I mean, I think there are people who would like to provoke one. I think the Iranians, again, for very sensible strategic reasons, figures that the United States is doing so much damage to itself that there's no point in giving the U.S. casus belli. In Iraq, it would seem that it would be hard for a conflict to arise since we are supporting Iran's allies. In Syria, the country is effectively divided. The side we're supporting, the Syrian Kurds, they're very uncertain. Should they make a deal with Damascus, or hold? But in any event, they have no interest in expanding across the Euphrates River. And I think it's unlikely that the Russians and the Iranians and the Syrian government would attack them as long as the Americans are there. So that may not be a casus belli. The real issue comes down to Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And let me now say a word about Saudi Arabia. Well, let me say a word about Saudi Arabia, but I'd like to say a little word of history about somebody else called Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein, in the 1980s, became the darling of the Reagan administration, and for a year of the George H.W. Bush administration, both of which resolutely opposed congressional action, which I was basically the architect of, to impose sanctions on Iraq for having used chemical weapons against the Kurds. In fact, the Reagan administration and the Bush senior administration opposed even cutting off U.S. aid to Iraq, arguing that it was premature. Now, why? Why had they decided that we shouldn't even cut off aid to Iraq for Saddam gassing his own people? Because they imagined that Saddam Hussein was going to be the next Sadat. You remember Sadat? Egypt had been allied with the Soviet Union. Sadat switched to the American side. Saddam had been allied with the Soviet Union. The hope was that they could get Saddam over to the American side. And second, that Saddam might stand up to Iran after I'd fought the Iran-Iraq war for 8 years. And finally, enormous business opportunities. The Iran-Iraq war was over. American business could get billions of dollars worth of contracts in the reconstruction of Iraq. They kind of failed to notice that Iraq had some pretty big debts, which helped explain the invasion of Kuwait the next year. But what was the problem with the strategy built around Saddam Hussein? I mean, he could have been switched against the Soviet Union. He was a bulwark against Iran. They did have a lot of oil. It was this. It was a guy who, when he came to power in a meeting of the Ba'ath Party, the top leadership, basically called out people and had them executed on the spot. Guy did that. A guy who, in September of 1980, launched an essentially unprovoked attack on his neighbor Iran. Iran was very unpopular then, but still. A guy who then, in the course of the Iran-Iraq war, became the first country to use chemical weapons against in international conflict, the first violation of the 1925 Geneva Protocols, the first use in international conflict since World War I, and then used it against defenseless Kurdish villagers. a guy who did that was not likely to be a good ally to the United States. It didn't, we don't have to make a moral judgment about him. It's a behavioral judgment. And of course, no surprise, that became clear when he invaded Kuwait. Now our Saudi alliance depends on who? Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince. And what is the crown prince's record? He's the de facto ruler because his father is basically has dementia. So he's the ruler of Saudi Arabia. He's 32, 33, I guess now. So what is his behavior? Of course, he's the architect of this war in Yemen with utter indifference to the human cost of it. Second, he launched a blockade of Qatar with basically for no reason. Third, he rounded up the wealthy people of Saudi Arabia, including the royal family, locked them up in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Some of them were allegedly tortured. He shook them down for billions of dollars as the price of getting out. The prime minister of Lebanon came to Saudi Arabia for a meeting. He was detained and forced to resign by this young Mohammed bin Salman. When he finally was able to escape, he unresigned and resumed being prime minister of Lebanon. This anti-corruption business, because I have to tell you, I don't know that all those people who had that wealth in Saudi Arabia got it through the sweat of their brows. But here, how did he spend? What did he do? He was on vacation on a beach in the Mediterranean, France. He saw a yacht he liked. He sent his aide out and spent $500 million to buy the yacht from a Russian tycoon. He liked the supposed Leonardo da Vinci, Salvator Mundi, that was on auction at Christie's. He paid $470 million for a possible da Vinci. And $300 million for a chateau in France. So austerity for the others, but not for a young MBS. Actually, rather reminiscent of Saddam Hussein, who built palaces all over Iraq for himself. And then, of course, and this is the conclusion of the CIA, he ordered the murder in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul of an American permanent resident and a Saudi national who wrote columns for the Washington Post that were, yes, critical of the young prince, but, hardly death sentence, sent a team on a special plane with a bone saw and a forensic scientist, murdered the man, carved up his body, and then came up with the most implausible set of excuses. And what has been the attitude of the United States toward all of these things? Toward all of them. It's been in Yemen to refuel Saudi planes and to sell arms that are being used against Yemeni civilians. It is to have said basically nothing about what happened to the Lebanese prime minister, to support Saudi Arabia against Qatar, even though we have a huge base in Qatar, our largest base in the region where our operations are flying from, and to announce that, to disbelieve the CIA's conclusion. Well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't order it. And to say, even if he did, it doesn't matter because he's so important. Important for what? Well, I think for some in the administration, it's actually as an ally in a possible war against Iran. I think that's the thinking of John Bolton. But in the case of Trump, he's pretty transparent. It's about money. I have to say, and now I'm going to be a little less objective than I have now, I'm not sure it's about $100 billion in sales for the American people. I think we're rather similar to the story that we have with the hotel in Moscow. It's about the business of the Trump family organization. And it is an extraordinary moment that we are. And we wonders if we're going to head to a war with Iran over all of this. Let me stop here and be happy to take your questions. Joyce.
Yeah, I have so many questions. What you're describing, all these actions, is this stupidity or is this actual, real politics going on? Do people have, oh my God.
Yep, you're on mic.
Oh, well, is this being done out of stupidity or is this being done with a real purpose that's above and beyond the putting hotels in the desert or whatever?
The question is this being done out of stupidity or realpolitik? I think for some people in the administration who are obsessed with Iran and who believe that there's a military solution to everything if we just, use our military assets, I wouldn't call that realpolitik. I would call it, a foolish faith in and not being very strategic, because the military doesn't work. And I taught at the National War College in Washington, and military officers understand that the military instrument is not always an effective one. It doesn't solve everything. And part of it is ideological, the belief that if that Iran is the source of all evil, just as the Soviet Union was the source of all evil, if that the U.S. can then defeat Iran militarily, that Iran might, the regime, the government there might be overthrown by increased pressure. So I think there's an ideological element, and I think there's an element of avarice.
If you could raise your hand, and then we'll come to you with a microphone.
So,
Where does the money come from?
Hold on a second. You gotta wait for the mic.
Where does the money come from to fund all these factions groups?
to fund.
All the groups that are fighting each other.
Well,
Money involved in someplace.
well, first, some of them, it's pretty clear. In Yemen, the Hadi government, the government that was overthrown by the Houthis, are being bankrolled by Saudi Arabia. The Houthis, they have an indigenous tribal base. They may be getting some funds from Iran, but I think it's primarily an indigenous movement. In Iraq, Iraq has very significant resources. Probably some Iraqi resources are being used at Iran's behest to fund the Assad and to send Iraqi fighters who are being paid by the Iraqi government that we support, are being sent to fight on behalf of Assad. So they're being paid by Iraq with Iraq's oil revenues. The Kurds have had in Iraqi Kurdistan have had a long tradition of fighting against the Iraqi government with no resources, but they have their own oil resources now, and they're supposed to get a share of the Iraqi budget. The Syrian Kurds, I think, are basically heroic because they are fighting without any salary, without any income, and it also, it's a very interesting place where there's strict gender. It's a Vermont-influenced place. Are you laughing? Murray Bookchin. This was I don't know if you know Murray Bookchin about him, but he was a guy came to the communes in Vermont in the 60s, went back to New Jersey, Columbia, got a PhD, and he taught in New Jersey, and then Bernie Sanders was elected mayor of Burlington. And he moved to Burlington to be with the People's Republic of Burlington. And he's a philosopher, and he came up with philosophy of strict gender equality, strict secularism, workers' participation, and radical environmentalism. And so you had Abdullah Ocalan, the leader of the PKK, and the Syrian Kurds are fairly closely aligned with him. Anyhow, he was a Stalinist, a Marxist, and after in 99 he was captured and by himself on this island in the Sea of Marmara with a life sentence. And Marx and Stalin are a bit out these days. So he starts reading Murray Bookchin. And he gets in touch with him and wants him to come visit. And Bookchin at this point was too old and he died. But his ideas are being implemented by the Syrian Kurds. So I don't know, there's this Vermont connection between Murray Bookchin and myself that you just probably didn't realize to that. But anyhow, they fight without any salary. The Syrian government, it's being part of their support comes from Iran, part of it from probably Russia, as well as indigenous resources. In the case of the Islamic fighters, see if I can go. The people up in Idlib, they're supported by Saudi Arabia and Emirates. And remember, there's also a great deal of just extortion. I mean, the Islamic State would go to, for example, Christians and say you have three choices: you can pay the tax, you can convert to Islam, or you can die. And they were selling art. They smashed up all these artifacts as adulterous and then sold them. As well as oil smuggling. So there are different resources that are financing all this, and including some of our tax dollars that are going to in Iraq on the same side as the Iranians. David.
Could you outline the history of the enmity between Iran and the United States?
What's the history of the enmity between Iran and the United States? On the government level, on the popular level, on the part of the Iranian people, aside from the Kurds, they're really the most pro-American people in the Middle East. And why? Well, partly that's a reaction to the kind of regime that they've had in Tehran, in Iran, since 1979. Since the Iranian Revolution, and because it is actually a relatively more liberal society. They have access to the internet. Facebook is not allowed, but they all have VPNs, so they get around it. For this audience, probably as technically unastute as me, in terms of virtual private networks, you can get around a lot of the censorship. In any event, on the official level, the complaint goes back to the U.S. role in overthrowing Mossadegh, the liberal Iranian prime minister, and restoring the Shah in 1953, and then the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and of course the taking of Americans as hostages. But the reality is, I think it's not about either of those things. I think in Iran, the anti-American stance of the government is just domestic politics. I was there in 2015 as they were debating the Iran nuclear deal. It hadn't quite been concluded, and the entire debate was the hardliners against Rouhani. The United States was almost irrelevant. And in the debate in the US Congress, Iran was almost irrelevant. It was Republicans against Obama. And frankly, I think that even this whole, from Trump's point of view, I think it's pretty clear that a major motivation for him, perhaps the major motivation to overturn the Iran nuclear deal, has nothing to do with its merits. It's that Obama negotiated it. He wants to undo the two signature achievements of Obama, President Obama, the health care and the Iran nuclear deal. Because because that's who he is. Please.
Yeah, but in all fairness, we've been trying to become a world power in the Mideast long before Trump, and we've been giving both Saudi Arabia and Israel trillions and trillions of dollars. A lot of people perceive it as our need to have world domination over the Mideast. And the intent is to disarm and weaken other surrounding countries. And I would like your perspective on that, because we do give these two countries, Israel's now the 5th largest superpower in the world. And I'm not sure what Saudi Arabia is, but we've known for decades about their human rights abuses, and we've continued to give them arms and money and everything. Thank you.
Yeah, first, just as a factual matter, yes, we've given billions. I wouldn't think it amounted even close to $1 trillion to Israel. But in the case of Saudi Arabia, we've actually been extracting money from them. We don't give Saudi Arabia any aid. We sell them stuff at marked up prices, and we ask them to fund things that we want funded because they're very rich. So Israel is a recipient of U.S. assistance. I'm sure the largest over ever. But on the other hand, Saudi Arabia is, if you will, almost a country that provides assistance to the United States. So they're two different things. But my
issue is I'm this close rapport with them despite.
I'm going to come to that. Yes, there's been a close rapport with both countries. They're very different, so I wouldn't make a comparison. Israel is a robust, argumentative democracy whose policies in the West Bank and Gaza are those of an occupying power. But in terms of internally, whereas Saudi Arabia is almost a medieval state with lots of wealth and with this very large ruling family. All administrations have had good relations with both of them. But what I would say begins to be, to be accurate here, the Obama administration basically looked the other way when the war in Yemen began. And I think one of the reasons they did was to tamp down the Saudi opposition to the Iran nuclear deal. And one of their concerns was that if Iran went nuclear, Saudi Arabia would go nuclear. And if Saudi Arabia went nuclear, and if Iran went nuclear, so would United Arab Emirates and probably Qatar. So that you would really have and then maybe Egypt, and so you'd really have an end to the nuclear non-proliferation regime. I think that from a national security point of view, if it was just Iran, it wouldn't be a problem, as big a problem. But the problem is if Iran goes nuclear, Saudi Arabia will go nuclear. And this comes back to the young prince. He has said that Saudi Arabia is open to having nuclear weapons, and he's trying to acquire the technology to manufacture, basically to for nuclear power plants, but without the safeguards, and to produce fuel without any safeguards, which of course means that you can do diversions. And the Trump administration seems to be supportive of that, which is really quite remarkable. I think the Congress certainly is opposed, and whether they will stop it, I don't know. I wouldn't say that Israel is the fifth superpower in the world, even if you measure it by nuclear weapons. The 5 permanent Security Council members certainly have more. Probably India and Pakistan have more. And you know, it's a relatively small country and small military. So please.
Let's see how many we have. 10 more minutes for question and answer. Let me see who question. Number 1. Who else has question? Anybody back there?
Over here.
Some people on the left there.
Okay. Number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. And then we will end up the evening. So, number 1,
I wanted to ask about sort of the basic religious conflict in the Middle East, the Shia versus the Sunni, which is sort of the overriding force in this whole thing, although there are all these actors who are, in many ways, not part of it or part of it. And to me, this conflict is inherently intractable, I think. I mean, well, can you give what your opinion is of this, how this is working out? Because you have, obviously, Saudi Arabia with the holder of all of the Sunni power and you know, Mecca and all of this. And then you've got Iran, which is the opposite kind of thing. And, you know, I don't know how this is ever going to be worked out.
The question is, can the Sunni Shiite split ever be worked out? You know, I guess I'd make a point, which is that you know, ethnic or national differences often are basically, you know, very hard to work out. Once a people, say the Kurds or the Slovenians or the Baltics, you know, want independence, have decided independence, they have their own distinct national identity, meaning their own language, I think you can't keep them in a country. These religious divisions, they wax and they wane. If you talk to Iraqis, Iraq's 20% Sunni Arabs, 60% Shiite, you know, of people who remember Iraq in the 50s, they say, we never knew who was Sunni or Shiite. And we never cared. Actually, I witnessed the same thing in Croatia, where, you know, Serbs are Orthodox and Croatians are Catholics. People say we never knew or cared. But then the war and the developments changed that. And it wasn't the American war, it was Saddam's repression of the Shia after the '91 war, when they staged an uprising, brutal repression for being Shia. And the Saudi-Iranian struggle it's religious, but it's also a struggle between two powers, big oil powers on opposite sides of the Gulf. In terms of the, you know, a lot of Muslims are like a lot of Christians. They really don't care. Let me just take a little poll. How many people know what transubstantiation is? Raise your hand. All right, yeah, a certain number in this educated group. I'm not surprised. But, you know, this was the 30 Years' War was about transubstantiation. Did the wafer and the wine literally become the flesh and blood of Christ, as the Catholics said, a miracle? Or was it symbolic, as the Protestants said? That was the 30 Years' War. And, you know, here we are in a church. I bet there's some Catholics here, or people at least who were raised Catholic. You know, unthinkable at that time, so who knows? But it's certainly real now. Question 2.
Over there. Here. Yep.
I was wondering that with regard to the things that you've been talking about tonight, about the role of Israel, two parts in particular. It seems that the Trump family has its strongest connection with Israel and Saudi Arabia. And given the deep enmity between Israel and Iran, like how much of a shadow does Israel play in this, even though they're not in the forefront necessarily?
Well, so the question is, what is the role of Israel in all of this? Leaving aside any business issues, which I'm not sure that that applies in Israel. I think it may well account for the defense of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. But the Netanyahu Likud government in Israel has been a big driver of the effort to undo the Iran nuclear agreement and to have a military strike against Iran. And again, just as I said, the debate in Iran was about domestic politics, the hardliners, Rouhani against Khamenei's side. In the U.S., the Congregational Republicans against Obama. It's the same issue in Israel. It was a device that Netanyahu used coming to the U.S. without an invitation from the U.S. president just before the Israeli elections. And the Israeli security establishment, the Shin Bet, the Mossad, the top ranks in the military, all think the Iran nuclear deal is in the national security interest of Israel because they understand that Israel is incapable of stopping Iran from getting nuclear weapons if it so decides. Israel is capable of bombing. But one thing you have to understand is that bombing is not a panacea. You can bomb a building, and it'd be amazing how quickly you can get things up and running again. The problem comes when if you keep bombing, then of course it will work because people are not going to come to work in a building that's being bombed. But you have to keep bombing, and Israel doesn't have that capability. So, but it was good. It was good domestic politics, so I think Israel, in that sense, as well as ideological. I mean, one of the things that's good. One of the points is that, and I think it's really important. When we talk about other foreign leaders, we often, ascribe to them, their motive is to stay in power. But, and with our own side, we have more virtuous motives. But in fact, people tend to believe their own propaganda. So even if Netanyahu, basically is a great election maneuver, I'm sure he persuades himself that that's true. And to be fair, even as the critics of the nuclear deal in the Congress, were looking at jabs at Obama, I think they also were persuading themselves that was true. Now, some of their subsequent behavior, is a little incomprehensible, but, okay, next.
We have one right here.
Yeah.
Thanks for your talk tonight. Earlier in your talk, you were talking about how in Iran right now, I can't remember, you said the younger generation or people in general just kind of don't really believe in the system. And I think in this country there may be a similar feeling. And with, that said, I think the cynicism is coming from an understanding that the political interest is kind of dominated by big business right now. And so what would our interest as citizens in this conflict in the Middle East, what would our interest be? What's the best case scenario? From not coming from a business perspective, but from just a kind of basic citizenship. Thanks.
I think our interest in this area, above all, is not to have a war. I think it's also in our interest not to have a nuclear-armed Iran, definitely not to have MBS with nuclear weapons. I worry much more about Saudi Arabia and MBS having nuclear weapons than I do about Iran. Not to have the United Arab Emirates. The spread of nuclear weapons is probably the greatest threat, short-term, immediate threat to the human race. Long-term maybe climate change, but climate change is killing you slowly, and this is really destroying things very quickly. And you know, I have to say, these are not people that I would trust with nuclear weapons. And that doesn't mean I trust everybody who has them either.
My question,
Number 4.
my question is going to be about, Iran is one of the premier partners in One Belt, One Road. 4 out of the 6 overland routes go through Iran, one of which goes directly to southern Iraq, the Shia held territory, then southern Syria, and then tops out through Lebanon and the Mediterranean. But rarely do you ever hear about any war with Iran mentioning One Belt, One Road, mentioning the fact that it's one of the other 2 key countries besides Russia that opens up the Caucasus and Central Asian markets. But it seems if there are any war with Iran, it's unavoidably a war that is about One Belt, One Road. What do you think about that? And is that on the mind of anyone that you know who is eager for war with Iran? Is this part of what they're thinking about?
Well, I can't fully go into the minds of those who might be advocating it, but I think my impression is no. This is not part of the any game against China, and nor do I think One Belt, One Road is a threat to the United States. I don't. You know, China's just not going to go out and conquer all these territories. Of course, if you're very hostile to one side, they may tend to look to somebody else to be their ally. After all, you know, the enemy of my enemy may be my friend. So that is another factor to think of. But do I think they're thinking about it? No way. I mean, I haven't. It never heard it mentioned, but it's an interesting thought.
Thank you.
And was it the one last question, or is that?
No, that's it.
Okay. Oh, wait a minute. We have to give one of the women, because we can't.
No, that's right. We cannot
Right here. One last question here.
Can you speak to the relationship between the PKK and the Kurds in Syria? Because, of course, the Turks consider the PKK a terrorist group, and that, in fact, makes the Syrian Kurds very vulnerable. Is there a relationship? What is it?
So the question is, what is the relationship between the PKK, the Turkish group that it is considered by Turkey, the United States, and the European Union to be a terrorist organization, and the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, which is the male fighters, the YPJ female fighters, and the PYD, which is their political party. You know, they are. There's certainly an ideological connection, and it's a kind of irony of the situation that of our group that was very isolated. I'm referring now to the Syrian Kurds. In 2014, as the Islamic State closed in on Kobani, and Turkish troops were just on the other side of the border. I've been to Kobani. I mean, the city's right on the border. Turkey refused to lift a finger. And why? Because they really wanted the Kurds to be eliminated there, because they saw them as brethren of the PKK. And President Obama made a decision to defy an ally and to deploy the United States Air Force to support somebody, to support a group that was, you know, had its associations with people that we considered tier 1 terrorists. It was, in my judgment, completely the right decision. And it goes to the next point, and I guess I'm not going to be able to go to Turkey again anyhow. Next point, which is, you know, I think the terrorist list can be very political. I mean, of course, a group like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, but the PKK, I think, would be better to think of as an insurgency. It doesn't make them good and doesn't mean their actions are good, but they have very significant military force, they have very significant political force, and the only way to deal with them is through a negotiated settlement. And the irony is that they're actually prepared to settle for pretty little at this point. The things that Erdogan has already offered and begun to take away, but like elected mayors in southeast Turkey with real powers, Kurdish language in schools, Kurdish broadcasting, all that's happened under Erdogan. And there was a 4-year peace process that he basically broke. But basically, what do they really want beyond those things? Amnesty. You know, so, I mean, to me, amnesty is a price worth paying. You know, I mean, unfortunately, in warfare, there are people who commit crimes, but if you can end the war cheaply, it's probably worth doing. But it's a good question, so thank you.
Okay, we thank you. And that's what that was from Vermont, which he gave you answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. See you all this time or some other time in 2019.
Don't forget 118 Elliott on next Saturday.
Oh, yes.
You got it. Yeah.
Right, good night.
It's good to see you. I just wanted to say hello before I head out.